back in 2021, Netflix announced a sequel series to That 70s Show, and people were hyped. I mean, I know I was. Like, I was literally in the middle of rewatching That 70s Show when it got announced, so it felt like perfect timing for me. I was telling everybody about it. I was sending the trailers out like I was a part of the marketing team out here. I really thought this was gonna be the reboot that hit like crack. And when it dropped, the fan base showed up. You know, this thing was top 10 on Netflix almost immediately. It had over 40 million watch hours in the first week. I mean, the fan base was there. Like, we showed up. But then we all watched it and it just kind of was okay. You know, it wasn't the worst thing ever, but it definitely wasn't that good. And that's the problem, because this is not the kind of show that could afford to be just okay. You know, when you bring something like That 70s Show back, it has to be an elite continuation. And honestly, there was really only one way to do this show right, and they didn't do it. But, you know, I'll get back to that later. So a lot of the core issues here were dialogue. I know a lot of people had issues with the writing and the way the dialogue was paced and all that kind of stuff. I mean, for me, it was terrible. You know, it only takes about an episode or two for you to start realizing that nobody within this cast just has a normal conversation. Every line is a punchline. It's just joke, and it really feels super forced, because nobody's responding to each other. It's like they're waiting their turn to say a punchline. And once you start to notice that, you stop seeing the characters and immersing yourself in the world, and you just start seeing kids reading off punchlines, and it gets really lame really fast. The natural feeling that the original show and cast was able to deliver on was actually incredible, and this new show just misses that mark by a mile, and they just totally dropped the ball. And because of that, it's hard to connect with this new cast. You know, not just, they're not terrible, but they're not strong enough to overcome the bad writing here, because a show like this has to thrive and live off of chemistry. And if the dialogue isn't natural or doesn't feel natural, then the chemistry is not going to feel natural either. You know, overall, this just doesn't feel like a real friend group. You know, they just feel like archetypes, and everyone's just kind of feeling a role. The more you watch, you realize that they're just copies. You know, you can see who they're supposed to be, or who they're supposed to be a copy of or an archetype of, but none of them are really able to just stand on their own as a truly unique character. So everything just feels super flat. And that's why, you know, every time the original cast shows up in this show, the show just gets infinitely better. These characters still feel like the original characters, and I'm still able to relate and connect to them. And the second they're on screen, you know, you just really feel the difference they make, which makes everything else look even worse than it already did. And another issue that I had was with the way they handled Eric's character. He's very absent father at this point. You know, obviously I know he's chasing a dream, chasing a job, but I don't know. I think the reasoning to justify him not being a part of the recurring cast, it just doesn't feel right, and it doesn't feel true to Eric's character. I don't know. You have one of the most important characters in the show, and you just barely use him. And I think a big part of this disappointment too, with Eric not being around and a lot of these other OG cast members, really comes from the expectation that the marketing was setting. You know, the original cast was all over the marketing for this show, in the trailers and part of the rollout, doing interviews. So you would just naturally think like, hey, these characters are gonna have bigger roles in the show. They might not be the main characters of the show, but they'll at least be recurring and, you know, be in and out and whatnot. And that just wasn't the case. You know, a lot of these characters like Eric and Fez and Kelso and Jackie are really just in the first batch of episodes, or, you know, in that part one of the show, which, you know, I hated that, dude, that they did part one, part two, part three. Like, that was stupid. So those characters are really just a part of part one, and after that they're pretty much completely absent from the rest of the series up into the cancellation. You know, you got Donna, and she becomes more of a recurring character and is around for a lot of part three. And then of course you still have Red, Kitty, and Bob, and they're all great, of course. So you're just kind of left with Red, Kitty, Bob, Donna, and the new group for the rest of the series after part 1. And if you weren't sold on the new characters, then in my opinion, that's where you lost a lot of people. I know in my initial watch of the show, as soon as everybody started to leave and it was just solely focused around the new cast, it just kind of lost me. I just didn't care enough. I wasn't emotionally invested in these characters. And not only that, but they're trying to retell the same coming of age stories that they already did in that 70s show. So, it just all kind of felt repetitive and almost like a cosplay of the old show. And again, once you kind of lose that connection, you start noticing that the world doesn't really hold up either. Because in my opinion, it just doesn't really feel like the 90s, or it's not distinctly 90s. There's references to different movies, music, different things that are going on at that time, but it's just not noticeable in my opinion. In that 70s show, the 70s felt like a real world environment. The sets, from going down to that little diner that they go to, or going to the water tower, or hanging out in the driveway, or going to a party, or these kids were always all over the place, and you got to have a real connection with Point Place. I think in this show you just don't get that, right? So again, this whole thing is just breaking apart, and nothing really feels like it has real weight going forward. These problems show up between the group, between Nate and Jay, or between Leia and Jay, or Nikki and Nate, but they all, don't really feel that serious, and they get solved fairly quickly. It's never something that has any time to breathe or build. And you might be saying, in a sitcom, well, don't they solve all their problems within a 20-minute frame? That's the whole point of a sitcom. No, that is not always the case. And then when it is the case, it has to be done right. Because, of course, in sitcoms, it is very sped up storytelling. But the greatest of the great, they're able to set up a problem within the first 5 minutes and spend the next 15 trying to solve it. And so, I don't know, by the end of those, they're able to give you a satisfying ending. And I think that this one just doesn't. There's just not enough to get invested in. It just feels like these are just stupid kid problems. And you might be saying, hey, maybe that's the point. But my problem is that you already did this before. It worked so well the first time in the 70s show because there wasn't really anything like that at the time when it came out. And a lot of people were able to relate, have those moments where it's like, hey, I did that growing up. Hey, I did that growing up. And they were able to see themselves within these characters. Either way, though, even the big moments in the show, they just kind of come and go. And I just hated that they leaned so heavily on the romance storylines. With the new group, it just feels like everything pertaining to them is about Nikki and Nate, or Leia and Jay. There's like maybe a couple moments here and there where you see Gwen kind of having her moments with her father, or I don't know, it just felt super forced. The majority of the problems are romance. Even with Gwen, one of her big storylines is that her boyfriend is leaving for college and they're probably gonna have to break up or something. And with Ozzy, his big problem is that he can't find another gay person, and then eventually he does. So it's all like romance, and it just doesn't feel earned at all. When nothing feels earned, it's hard to care about these characters. It really is. And I tried my best, but it was just really hard to care about them. And that's when it really clicked for me that this show was built kind of backwards. It had everything that it needed. It had the original set, original production team. You had the same creators, all that. On top of that, people's nostalgia was sky high at that time. Like, that 70s show was huge on streaming services at that time, and I think that was a big part of why the show got announced and made, because you saw all the reboots, and hell, why not take a chance on it? But I feel like they just didn't understand why the show was so popular and why it worked so well. They understand the formula of creating that original show, but they just tried to do it again, and you can't do it again, because there's a version of this show that would have worked 100%, would have been an absolute banger show. Netflix, you need to hire me. Here's the pitch. You don't start over with a new cast of kids. You instead follow the original characters, Eric, Donna, Jackie, Kelso, and Fez, as they're going into their 30s, dealing with life in the 90s. And in this continuation, you get to continuously grow with those characters that you already loved so much. Instead of having to relive all of those coming of age stories again with the 90s show. Now you're kind of watching these characters deal with jobs, relationships, kids, a new stage in life. Like, that's the continuation. And then over time, you're able to slowly integrate this new cast of kids into the main character roles. And I think maybe, you know, that would have been a way to get the fans to actually care about those kids. You got to make them connect with the original cast to really make us care, you know? And so you kind of let that stuff gradually happen and you don't force it. You're getting to go through a new stage of life with these characters. That's what made the pitch of this show so interesting in the first place, was that you had all the OG people within the trailers and in the first couple episodes and having reappearances. Like, the original fan base came for that. And I think when you made this show, you forgot who this show was for, because if you're targeting the audience that loved that 70s show, those people are now a lot older and have gotten a lot more life experience. Speaking as somebody that loved the show, I want to hear new stories. I want to hear these characters deal with different problems in a different stage of life. And I think the only thing that stopped that from happening was, of course, I don't think any of these actors, from Ashton Kutcher, Mila Kunis, Topher Grace, I don't think that they wanted big roles in this show. I mean, these are all actors that I think are just well past this show, and I don't think they wanted to come back to it in full-time roles. And I get that. But that's really the whole point of this video, to be honest, because if you couldn't pull that storyline, then you just don't make this show. You just don't. This is the only way it would have worked. This is the only way to do it, and that's exactly why the way that they did it ended up failing. I think that the intentions here were good, but because they chose the route that they chose, they ended up kind of icing out the original fan base and then finding themselves in a place where you're asking, you know, who was this show even for?